Sarah Chen thought she knew everything about power and money. As one of the youngest female billionaires in tech, she had built her empire from nothing, fought through boardrooms filled with men who underestimated her, and earned respect through sheer determination. But on a warm Saturday afternoon, at an exclusive wedding in Malibu, everything she believed about influence and authority would be turned upside down. She had brought Marcus Thompson as her plus one, a quiet, unassuming man she'd met at a coffee shop who worked as a freelance consultant. He wore simple clothes, drove an old Honda, and never mentioned his work in detail. To Sarah, he seemed refreshingly normal compared to the usual crowd of ambitious executives and social climbers in her world. What Sarah didn't expect was for the Groom heir to a media empire worth billions to see Marcus across the crowded reception and immediately excuse himself from his own wedding celebration. She watched in stunned silence as one of the most powerful young men in America approached their table, his face pale with what looked like genuine fear. "Boss," the groom said, his voice barely above a whisper as he bowed slightly. "I didn't know you would be here." In that moment, Sarah realized she had been completely wrong about the quiet man sitting beside her. The question that would haunt her for months afterwards was simple. Who exactly had she been dating? And why was someone worth $8 billion calling him boss? Sarah Chen had never been the type to believe in coincidence, but even she had to admit that meeting Marcus Thompson felt like fate. It was a Tuesday morning in March, and she had ducked into a small coffee shop in downtown San Francisco to escape a sudden rainstorm. The place was nothing special. Worn wooden tables, mismatched chairs, and the kind of atmosphere that attracted freelancers with laptops rather than business executives in $1,000 suits. She had been running late for a board meeting at Chen Technologies, the artificial intelligence company she had built from her Stanford dorm room into a $15 billion empire. At 28, Sarah was used to being the youngest person in every room, the only woman at most tables, and often the smartest person making decisions that affected thousands of jobs and millions of dollars. The pressure was constant, but she thrived on it. The coffee shop was packed, and every table was occupied except for one small spot near the window, where a man sat alone, reading what appeared to be a philosophy book. He looked to be in his early 30s, with dark hair that needed a trim, and wearing a simple grey sweater that had seen better days. What struck her most was how completely at ease he seemed, as if the chaos of the busy cafe couldn't touch him. "Excuse me," Sarah said, approaching his table with her coffee. "Would you mind if I shared this table? Everywhere else is full." He looked up, and she was surprised by his eyes. They were a deep brown, but there was something in them that suggested he had seen more of the world than most people twice his age. "Of course," he said, closing his book and sliding his things to one side. "Please, sit." Sarah settled into the chair across from him, checking her phone for messages from her assistant. She had 12 missed calls and 37 emails, all marked urgent. This was normal for her morning routine, but today felt different somehow. Maybe it was the rain, or maybe it was the strange sense of calm that seemed to radiate from the man across from her. "Busy morning?" he asked, nodding toward her phone. "Every morning," Sarah replied, then realized how that might sound. "Sorry, I don't mean to be rude. Work is just..." She gestured vaguely at her phone. "All-consuming," he finished for her. "I understand. I'm Marcus, by the way." Sarah. She hesitated, then decided against giving her last name. It was refreshing to meet someone who didn't immediately recognize her from magazine covers or business news segments. They talked for 20 minutes, which stretched into 30, and then 45. Sarah found herself cancelling her board meeting, something she had never done in her entire career. Marcus was unlike anyone she had ever met. He listened more than he spoke, asked thoughtful questions, and seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts on everything, from artificial intelligence to the philosophy book he had been reading. "What do you do for work?" Sarah asked, realizing she had been talking about herself for most of their conversation. "Consulting," Marcus said simply. "I help people solve problems." "What kind of problems?" "The complicated kind." He smiled when he said this, and Sarah got the impression that he was being deliberately vague, but not in a way that felt secretive or suspicious, more like someone who was used to keeping his professional life separate from his personal interactions. Over the following weeks, they met at the same coffee shop several times. Sarah found herself looking forward to these encounters in a way that surprised her. She had dated before, mostly other executives, entrepreneurs, or men from wealthy families who moved in the same social circles she did. But those relationships had always felt like business arrangements disguised as romance. With Marcus, she could talk about ideas, about books, about life outside of quarterly reports and stock prices. Marcus never seemed impressed by her wealth or status. When she mentioned that she ran a tech company, he nodded with polite interest but didn't ask for details. When she showed up in her Tesla, he complimented the car but didn't ask how much it cost. When she mentioned having dinner at an exclusive restaurant, he listened to a story about the food rather than commenting on how difficult it was to get a reservation. After their 6th coffee shop meeting, Sarah decided to take a risk. "Would you like to have dinner sometime? Somewhere other than this place?" Marcus considered this for a moment. "I'd like that," he said. "But I should probably warn you that I'm not really the fancy restaurant type." "That's fine," Sarah said, surprising herself. "I know a great little Italian place that's nothing fancy. Family-owned, been around for 40 years. They had dinner at Nonna's, a restaurant in North Beach that Sarah had discovered during her college years, but rarely visited anymore. Marcus fit in perfectly with the casual atmosphere, chatting easily with their elderly waitress and complimenting the simple but delicious food. Sarah realized that she had never brought any of her previous dates to a place like this. Most of her relationships had played out in Michelin-starred restaurants and exclusive clubs. "This is perfect," Marcus said, raising his glass of wine. "Thank you for bringing me here." As they walked back to their cars after dinner, Marcus stopped suddenly. "Sarah, I should tell you something. I don't usually date." "Usually?" "I mean, I don't really have a normal life. My work takes me away frequently and it can be complicated. I don't want you to think I'm not interested, because I am. Very interested, but I want to be honest about my situation." Sarah studied his face in the streetlight. There was something almost sad in his expression, as if he was expecting her to walk away. "We all have complicated lives," she said. "I work 18-hour days, I travel constantly, and I've been called cold and calculating by every major business publication in the country. If you can handle that, I think I can handle whatever your complications are." Marcus smiled then, really smiled, and Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. "In that case," he said, "would you like to be my date to a wedding next month?" "It's in Malibu, very exclusive. Fair warning, it's going to be full of extremely wealthy people who take themselves very seriously." "Sounds terrible," Sarah said, grinning. "I can't wait." As she drove home that night, Sarah realized she was happier than she had been in years. Marcus was exactly what she needed. Someone who saw her as a person rather than a business opportunity. Someone who could make her laugh. Someone who seemed completely unimpressed by the world of money and power that had consumed her entire adult life. What she didn't know was that Marcus had spent the entire evening wrestling with whether to tell her the truth about himself. He had been planning to disappear from her life the way he had learned to do when civilian relationships became too complicated. But something about Sarah made him want to try something he had never attempted before, being with someone while keeping his real identity hidden. The wedding invitation in his apartment was addressed to M. Thompson and Guest, but the name on Marcus's real identification was different. So was his net worth, his background, and the reason that some of the most powerful people in the world answered his calls at any hour of the day or night. Marcus had built his entire adult life around staying invisible, around being the man behind the scenes who solved problems that governments and corporations couldn't handle. He had never wanted to be in the spotlight, never wanted to be known. But for the first time in 15 years, he found himself wondering what it would be like to share his real life with someone. The wedding would be a test, though he didn't realize it yet. In a room full of people who knew exactly who he was, keeping his secret from Sarah would be nearly impossible. But as he fell asleep that night, Marcus decided that some risks were worth taking. 3 weeks later, as Sarah picked out a dress for the wedding, she was still thinking about Marcus's comment about wealthy people who took themselves seriously. She assumed he was just being modest about the guest list. After all, how exclusive could a wedding really be? And what were the chances that she would know anyone there? The answer to both questions would change everything she thought she knew about the quiet, unassuming man who had wandered into her life through a coffee shop on a rainy Tuesday morning. The wedding invitation that arrived at Sarah's office was unlike anything she had ever seen. The paper felt expensive, thick, cream-colored stock with edges that had been cut by hand. The calligraphy was perfect, each letter formed with the kind of precision that only came from years of training. But what caught her attention wasn't the elegant script or the embossed seal. It was the address, a private estate in Malibu that she recognized from architectural magazines as one of the most exclusive properties on the California coast. Sarah had assumed that Marcus's comment about wealthy people was just his way of being modest. She figured they would be attending a nice but relatively normal wedding, the kind where the biggest concern would be whether the chicken or fish would be better. As she researched the venue, however, she began to realize that this was going to be something entirely different. The estate belonged to the Whitmore family, a name that appeared regularly in Forbes lists and business headlines. Richard Whitmore had built a media empire worth over $12 billion, controlling newspapers, television networks, and digital platforms across 3 continents. His son Jonathan was the groom, and according to the society pages, this wedding had been planned for over a year, with a guest list that read like a who's who of American power. Sarah found herself feeling nervous for the first time in years. She was used to high-stakes situations: boardroom negotiations, investor presentations, congressional testimony about artificial intelligence regulation. But those were professional settings where she knew the rules. This was Marcus's world, and she realized she knew almost nothing about how he fit into it. When she called Marcus to ask about the dress code, he seemed genuinely surprised by her concern. "Just wear something you feel comfortable in," he said. "You always look beautiful." "Marcus, this is the Whitmore wedding." I looked it up. There are going to be senators there, CEOs, people from old money families that have been powerful since before California was a state. I can't just wear anything. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Sarah, you're worth $15 billion. You've been on the cover of Time magazine. You've testified before Congress about the future of technology. Why are you worried about what to wear to a wedding?" It was a fair question, and Sarah wasn't sure she had a good answer. Something about Marcus made her want to fit into his world, whatever that world might be. With her business associates, she never had to worry about belonging. Her success spoke for itself, but Marcus seemed to exist outside the usual hierarchies of wealth and achievement, and that made her uncertain. "I guess I just want to make a good impression," she said finally. "You will," Marcus said, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost sad. "Trust me, everyone there will be very impressed by you." The week before the wedding, Sarah threw herself into research mode. She read everything she could find about the Whitmore family, about the bride and groom, about the other guests who had been mentioned in the social media coverage. What she discovered was that this wasn't just a wedding, it was a gathering of some of the most influential people in America. The bride, Catherine Morrison, came from a banking dynasty that had been powerful since the 1800s. Her father controlled assets worth over $20 billion. The guest list included tech moguls, media personalities, politicians, and members of families whose names were synonymous with American wealth. It was exactly the kind of event that Sarah would normally attend for networking purposes, except she had never been invited to this particular circle. On Friday night, as she packed for the weekend in Malibu, Sarah realized that she was more nervous than excited. She had chosen a midnight blue dress that was elegant but not ostentatious, hoping to strike the right balance between fitting in and staying true to herself. She had also packed a backup dress just in case. Marcus picked her up at noon on Saturday, driving the same old Honda Civic that he always used. Sarah had offered to arrange for a car service, thinking it might be more appropriate for such a high-profile event, but Marcus had declined. "I prefer to drive myself," he had said. "It gives us more flexibility." As they drove up the Pacific Coast Highway toward Malibu, Sarah found herself studying Marcus's profile. He seemed completely relaxed, one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting on the center console between them. He was wearing a well-tailored navy suit that she had never seen before, and she realized that this was the most formal she had ever seen him dressed. "Have you been to many weddings like this?" she asked. "A few," Marcus said, "though I usually try to avoid them if I can." "Why?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Large gatherings can be complicated for me. Too many people who want to talk business when they should be celebrating." Sarah assumed he meant that people would try to pitch him consulting projects, not realizing that Marcus was worried about exactly the opposite problem. In a room full of people who knew his real identity, maintaining his cover story was going to require careful navigation. The Whitmore estate was even more impressive in person than it had appeared in the photographs. The main house was a sprawling Mediterranean-style villa that seemed to grow organically from the cliff top, with terraced gardens that cascaded down toward the ocean. As they drove through the gate, Sarah counted at least 50 cars in the parking area, including several that she recognized as belonging to Fortune 500 CEOs. "Modest little gathering?" Sarah said, trying to keep her tone light. Marcus smiled. The Whitmores aren't known for their restraint. They made their way toward the ceremony area, which had been set up on a manicured lawn overlooking the Pacific. White chairs were arranged in perfect rows, with an aisle that led to an altar decorated with thousands of white roses. Sarah estimated that the flowers alone had probably cost more than most people's yearly salary. As they found their seats, Sarah began to recognize faces from business magazines and news programs. 2 rows ahead of them sat the CEO of the largest social media platform in the world. Across the aisle was a Supreme Court justice. Behind them was an actress whose films had grossed over $2 billion worldwide. "How do you know the Groom?" Sarah asked quietly. "We've worked together on some projects," Marcus said. "Jonathan's a good kid, even if his father can be difficult." The ceremony was beautiful, but surprisingly traditional. Jonathan Whitmore, despite being worth billions of dollars, seemed genuinely emotional as he watched his bride walk down the aisle. Catherine Morrison looked stunning in a dress that Sarah recognized as haute couture from one of the most exclusive designers in Paris. The officiant was a federal judge who had been appointed to the bench by 3 different presidents. As the couple exchanged vows, Sarah found herself watching Marcus more than the bride and groom. There was something in his expression that she couldn't quite read. Not sadness exactly, but a kind of wistfulness that made her wonder what he was thinking about.
After the ceremony, cocktails were served on a terrace that offered sweeping views of the ocean.
Sarah accepted a glass of champagne and prepared herself for the kind of small talk that dominated high society events. She had learned over the years that these gatherings followed predictable patterns. People would ask about her company, make comments about her success, and try to determine whether she might be useful to them in some way. What she didn't expect was for everyone to be looking at Marcus. It started subtly. As they moved through the crowd, Sarah noticed that conversations would pause when Marcus approached. People would nod respectfully, almost deferentially, before introducing themselves to Sarah. Several guests seemed to know Marcus well, but they spoke to him in the careful, formal way that people used with someone they considered important. Strange, Sarah thought to herself. Maybe he's more successful than he lets on. The first real clue that something unusual was happening came when they encountered Margaret Chen, no relation to Sarah, despite sharing a last name. Margaret was the CEO of one of the largest investment banks in the world, a woman known for her sharp intelligence and sharper tongue. Sarah had met her several times at industry events and had always found her to be confident to the point of intimidation. But when Margaret saw Marcus, her entire demeanor changed. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice noticeably quieter than usual. "I wasn't expecting to see you here."
Margaret, Marcus replied with a slight nod. Congratulations on the Singapore deal.
"I heard it went very well." Margaret looked surprised. "You heard about Singapore?" "That was supposed to be confidential until next week." Marcus just smiled. News travels fast in small circles. As Margaret moved away, still looking slightly unsettled, Sarah stared at Marcus. "How did you know about a confidential banking deal?" "I keep up with business news," Marcus said. But there was something evasive in his tone that Sarah had never heard before. The next hour brought a series of similar encounters. A tech entrepreneur who had revolutionized online commerce spoke to Marcus like he was reporting to a superior. A media executive who controlled half the entertainment industry in Los Angeles asked Marcus's opinion on a merger that hadn't been announced publicly. A real estate mogul who owned properties in 12 countries mentioned a project they had discussed in terms that suggested Marcus was somehow involved in deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Sarah began to feel like she was watching Marcus transform before her eyes. The quiet, modest man she had been dating was being treated like someone at the very top of whatever hierarchy these people belonged to. But Marcus himself never changed. He remained polite but reserved, answering questions carefully and never volunteering information about his own activities. The moment that everything crystallized came when they were approached by David Kim, a venture capitalist who had funded some of the most successful tech startups of the past decade. Sarah knew David's reputation. He was brilliant, ruthless, and had never been known to show deference to anyone. "Marcus," David said, and there was something almost like relief in his voice. "Thank God you're here. I've been trying to reach you about the Jakarta situation. My people are saying it's impossible, but I know you have ways of making impossible things happen." Sarah watched Marcus's face carefully. For just a moment she saw something flicker in his expression, not annoyance exactly, but the look of someone who had been hoping to avoid a particular conversation. "This isn't the time or place, David," Marcus said quietly. "Enjoy the wedding." David nodded immediately and walked away, but not before giving Marcus a look that suggested their conversation was far from over. Sarah was about to demand an explanation when the dinner bell rang, calling everyone to the reception tent. As they walked toward their table, she noticed that Marcus seemed to be deliberately avoiding eye contact with several other guests, and that more than a few people were watching him with expressions of curiosity and respect. Whatever Marcus's real story was, Sarah realized, She was about to find out. Because in a room full of the most powerful people in America, it was becoming clear that her quiet, unassuming boyfriend was someone much more significant than he had ever led her believe. The reception tent was a masterpiece of wedding design, with crystal chandeliers hanging from a ceiling draped in ivory silk and tables set with china that probably cost more per plate than most people's monthly rent. Sarah and Marcus were seated at table 12, which she noticed was positioned with a clear view of the head table, but far enough from the center of attention to allow for private conversation. As they took their seats, Sarah was introduced to their table mates. A tech executive from Silicon Valley, a federal judge from Washington, D.C., a real estate developer from Manhattan, and a woman who owned a chain of luxury hotels across Europe. The conversation was exactly what she expected from a gathering of successful, wealthy people: polite inquiries about business, careful discussions of market trends, and the kind of networking that happened naturally when powerful people found themselves in the same room. What continued to puzzle Sarah was how everyone seemed to know Marcus, and how they spoke to him with a level of respect that went beyond mere professional courtesy. The tech executive mentioned a consultation Marcus had provided that had saved his company from a hostile takeover. The judge referenced Marcus's insights on a case that involved international law. The hotel owner talked about Marcus's help with a delicate situation involving government regulations in 3 different countries. Marcus participated in these conversations politely but minimally, always steering the discussion back to the other person's work rather than elaborating on his own involvement. Sarah found herself studying his face, looking for clues about what kind of consulting work he actually did that would put him in contact with such a diverse group of powerful people. The dinner service began with a first course that had been flown in from France that morning: oysters from a specific region that were supposedly impossible to obtain in the United States. As Sarah tasted the oyster, she noticed Marcus checking his phone discreetly under the table. His expression changed slightly as he read whatever message had arrived, and she saw him type a quick response before putting the phone away. "Everything okay?" she asked quietly. "Just work," Marcus said. "Sometimes problems don't take weekends off." Before Sarah could ask what kind of problem might require attention during a Saturday evening wedding, the lights dimmed and Jonathan Whitmore stood to give his speech. The groom looked genuinely happy as he thanked the guests for attending and spoke about how he had met Catherine during a business trip to London. His speech was charming and personal, the kind of toast that made even cynical guests smile. But halfway through Jonathan's speech, Sarah noticed that he kept glancing toward their table. At first, she thought he might be looking at one of their other table mates, but as she followed his line of sight, she realized he was looking directly at Marcus. There was something in the groom's expression that looked almost like nervousness, as if he was seeking approval from someone in the audience. When Jonathan finished his speech and the applause died down, he stepped away from the microphone and began making his way through the crowd, stopping at various tables to thank guests personally. Sarah watched as he moved closer to their table, noting that his path seemed deliberately planned to end with them. "Sarah," Marcus said quietly, "I need to tell you something before Jonathan gets over here." But it was too late. Jonathan Whitmore, heir to a $12 billion media empire and one of the most powerful young men in America, had reached their table. What happened next would replay in Sarah's mind for months afterward. Jonathan approached Marcus's chair and stopped. His face went slightly pale, and for a moment he looked exactly like what he was, a young man in his early 30s who had just spotted someone who made him nervous. The confident groom who had been working the room with ease suddenly seemed uncertain. "Boss," Jonathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. The word was spoken with such genuine deference that everyone at the table immediately stopped their conversations and turned to look. "I didn't know you would be here." Sarah felt the world shift around her. "Boss." Jonathan Whitmore, worth billions of dollars, had just called Marcus boss. Not in a joking way, not as a casual greeting, but with the kind of respect that suggested a real hierarchy between them. Marcus looked uncomfortable for the first time since Sarah had known him. "Hello, Jonathan. Congratulations on your wedding. Catherine is lovely." Jonathan nodded, still standing beside Marcus's chair, as if waiting for permission to sit or leave. "Thank you, sir. Is there anything I can do for you? Anything you need?" "Just enjoy your reception," Marcus said gently. "This is your day. Don't worry about anything else." The relief on Jonathan's face was visible. "Of course. Thank you." He started to walk away, then turned back. "Sir, the situation we discussed last month, it's been resolved. Exactly as you suggested." Marcus nodded once. "I'm glad to hear it. After Jonathan left, an awkward silence settled over the table. Sarah stared at Marcus, her mind racing through everything she thought she knew about him and trying to reconcile it with what she had just witnessed. The other guests at their table were looking between Sarah and Marcus, with expressions that suggested they were just as curious about the dynamic they had witnessed. "I think I need some air," Sarah said, standing up abruptly. Marcus immediately rose as well. "Sarah, let me explain." She walked quickly toward the edge of the tent, Marcus following close behind. When they reached a quiet spot overlooking the ocean, Sarah turned to face him. In the moonlight, he looked exactly like the man she had been dating for 2 months. The same gentle eyes, the same slight smile, the same understated presence. But everything she thought she knew about him had just been turned upside down. "What just happened in there?" Sarah asked. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as something he did when he was thinking carefully about what to say. "I should have told you before we came here. I knew this might happen." "Told me what exactly?" "That one of the most powerful young men in America calls you boss? That people worth billions of dollars ask for your permission before they make decisions? That everyone at this wedding seems to know who you are except for the woman you've been dating?" "My work is more complicated than I led you to believe," Marcus said carefully. "What kind of consulting do you do, Marcus?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the ocean. "I solve problems that other people can't solve. Problems that involve governments, multinational corporations, international law, financial markets. When someone has a situation that's too sensitive for normal channels, they call me."
What does that mean? It means I have access to information that most people don't.
"It means I know how to navigate systems that most people can't understand. It means that sometimes I can make things happen that seem impossible to everyone else." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. "Are we talking about legal things?" "Always legal," Marcus said immediately, "but not always conventional. I work in the spaces between what governments and corporations do officially. Sometimes the right phone call to the right person can solve a problem that would otherwise take years to resolve through normal channels." "And Jonathan Whitmore? Why does he call you boss?" Marcus sighed. "Because I helped his father build the media empire that Jonathan inherited. Richard Whitmore had the vision and the ambition, but he needed someone who could navigate the regulatory environment, manage international partnerships, handle situations that required discretion. I've been working with the Whitmore family for 15 years. The pieces were starting to come together in Sarah's mind, but the picture they formed was nothing like what she had expected. "So you're not actually a freelance consultant?" "Not exactly." "What are you exactly?" Marcus turned to look at her directly.
I'm the person who makes things work when the normal systems fail.
"I have relationships with people in government, in international business, in financial markets. When someone like Jonathan has a problem that could destroy their company or their family, they come to me because I can find solutions that other people can't see." "How wealthy are you, Marcus?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah had assumed that Marcus was comfortable but not wealthy. His modest apartment, his old car, his simple clothes had all suggested someone who lived well but without extravagance. Now she was wondering if that had all been an elaborate disguise. "Wealthy enough that money isn't a consideration in my decisions," Marcus said finally. "That's not an answer. My net worth is approximately $47 billion. Sarah felt like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. $47 billion. That made Marcus one of the wealthiest people in the world, wealthier than most heads of state, wealthier than some small countries. And he had been pretending to be a modest consultant who drove a Honda and lived in a simple apartment. $47 billion, she repeated. Give or take a few billion, depending on market conditions. And you never thought to mention this? Marcus looked genuinely pained. "Sarah, I've spent my entire adult life staying invisible. My power comes from the fact that most people don't know who I am or what I do. When people know you have that kind of influence and wealth, every relationship becomes transactional. Everyone wants something from you, so you decided to lie to me. I decided to see if it was possible to have a normal relationship with someone. You're brilliant, successful, and independent. I thought maybe with you it could be different. Maybe we could just be two people who enjoyed each other's company." Sarah turned away from him, looking out at the ocean. She understood his reasoning, but the betrayal still stung. For 2 months she had been worrying about whether she was good enough for his world, not realizing that his world was so far beyond anything she had imagined that her own success seemed almost insignificant by comparison. "So what happens now?" she asked. That depends on you, Marcus said. I understand if you can't trust me after this. I understand if you feel like I've been lying to you, because in many ways I have. But my feelings for you are real, Sarah. That part was never pretense. Before Sarah could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of someone approaching. They turned to see Catherine Morrison Whitmore, the bride, walking toward them. Even in the moonlight, her wedding dress was stunning, and she moved with the kind of grace that came from years of finishing school and social training. I'm sorry to interrupt, Catherine said, but Marcus, my father would like to speak with you. He says it's urgent. Marcus looked at Sarah. I should probably handle this. Can we continue our conversation later? Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure what else there was to say. As Marcus walked back toward the reception tent with Catherine, Sarah remained on the terrace, trying to process everything she had learned in the past 20 minutes. Marcus Thompson, the quiet man she had met in a coffee shop, was apparently one of the most powerful people in the world, and somehow, that revelation made her feel smaller and more uncertain than she had felt in years. Sarah stood alone on the terrace for nearly 30 minutes, watching the waves crash against the cliffs below and trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. The sounds of the reception continued behind her. Laughter, music, the gentle hum of conversation, among some of the most powerful people in America. But she felt completely disconnected from all of it, as if she were watching someone else's life unfold. When Marcus finally returned, he looked tired in a way she had never seen before. The easy confidence that usually characterized his movements was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like resignation. How did it go? Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Catherine's father has a situation in Eastern Europe, some regulatory issues that could shut down 3 of his television networks. He wanted my advice on how to handle it. And? I gave him some names to call, some strategies to consider. It's not my problem to solve, but I can point him in the right direction. Sarah studied Marcus's face in the moonlight. Does this happen often? People pulling you aside at social events to ask for help with billion-dollar problems? More often than I'd like, Marcus said. It's one of the reasons I don't usually attend events like this. When people know what you can do, they assume you're always available to do it. They walked back toward the reception tent in silence. The evening was winding down, with many guests beginning to say their goodbyes to the bride and groom. Sarah noticed that several people tried to catch Marcus's attention as they moved through the crowd, but he politely deflected their attempts at conversation. On the drive back to San Francisco, neither of them spoke much. Sarah found herself looking at Marcus with new eyes, trying to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the person she had seen at the wedding. The old Honda suddenly seemed less like modest transportation and more like an elaborate disguise. Even the way he drove, calm, confident, completely at ease, now struck her as the behavior of someone who was used to being in control of much larger and more complex situations. Can I ask you something? Sarah said as they approached the city. Of course. The apartment you live in, the car you drive, the clothes you wear, is any of that real? Marcus considered this for a moment. The apartment is real. I own the building, but I actually live in that unit. The car belongs to one of my security people, but I drive it because it doesn't attract attention. The clothes are just clothes. I've never seen the point in spending money on things that don't matter. But you could afford anything. I could afford most things, Marcus corrected. But that doesn't mean I want them. I spent my 20s accumulating wealth and power because I thought that was what success looked like. I spent my 30s learning that having unlimited resources can be more isolating than having none at all. They reached Sarah's apartment building and Marcus pulled up to the curb. For a moment, neither of them moved to get out of the car. What happens now, Marcus? Sarah asked. Do we pretend tonight didn't happen? Do you go back to being a modest consultant, and I go back to thinking you're impressed by my success? I don't know, Marcus said honestly. I've never been in this situation before. What situation? I've never cared enough about someone to want to tell them the truth about who I am. I've never met someone I thought might actually understand the complications that come with the kind of life I live. Sarah looked at him carefully. And you think I might understand? You've built something from nothing. You know what it's like to have people constantly wanting things from you. You understand the isolation that comes with success. I thought maybe you could relate to the choices I've made, even if you don't agree with them. Sarah got out of the car and walked around to Marcus's window. He rolled it down and looked up at her. I need some time to think about this, she said. Not about you, but about everything. This changes the dynamic between us in ways I'm not sure I understand yet. Marcus nodded. I understand. Take all the time you need. As Sarah walked into her building, She felt Marcus watching her until she disappeared from sight. Over the next week, she found herself unable to concentrate on work in a way that was completely unlike her. Her assistant rescheduled 3 meetings because Sarah seemed distracted. Her board of directors noticed that she was less decisive than usual. Her friends asked if she was feeling well. The problem wasn't that Marcus had lied to her, though that was certainly part of it. The real issue was that learning about his wealth and influence had made her question everything about their relationship. Had he been genuinely interested in her, or had she simply been an amusing diversion for someone who could have anyone he wanted? Did her own success mean anything to someone who operated at a level that made her $15 billion company seem like a small business? On Thursday evening, Sarah was working late in her office when her assistant knocked on the door. "Ms. Chen? There's someone here to see you. He says his name is Marcus Thompson, but he's not on your schedule." Sarah's heart jumped. She'd been thinking about calling Marcus for 3 days, but hadn't been able to decide what she wanted to say to him. "Send him in." Marcus entered her office carrying 2 cups of coffee from the shop where they had first met. He looked around at her space, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, the awards and magazine covers on the walls, the high-tech conference table where she held meetings with world leaders and tech giants. "Impressive," he said, setting 1 cup of coffee on her desk. "This is more like what I expected when I first met you. You brought coffee. I thought we should start over." "Go back to the beginning." Marcus sat down in the chair across from her desk. "Sarah Chen, my name is Marcus Thompson. I solve complicated problems for people who have too much money and not enough sense. I live alone, I work too much, and I've never met anyone who made me want to risk telling them who I really am. Until I met you." Sarah couldn't help but smile. "That's a much more honest introduction than your first one. I should have been honest from the beginning." "I want to try again, if you're willing." "With honesty this time?" "Complete honesty. You can ask me anything and I'll tell you the truth. About my work, about my wealth, about why I live the way I do. About why I've never had a relationship that lasted longer than a few months. About why meeting you scared me more than any business deal I've ever handled." Sarah picked up her coffee and settled back in her chair. "Okay, let's start with the basics. What exactly do you do for a living?" "I run a company called Thompson Strategic Solutions. We have offices in 12 countries, and we employ about 400 people, though most of them don't know they work for me directly. We handle situations that fall between what governments can do officially and what corporations can manage through normal channels." "Can you give me an example?" Marcus thought for a moment. "Last year, a pharmaceutical company developed a new treatment for malaria, but they couldn't get it approved in several African countries because of bureaucratic complications. The delay was going to cost lives. I made some phone calls, arranged some meetings, and the approvals went through in 6 weeks instead of 6 months. How do you make something like that happen? Relationships, information, understanding how systems actually work rather than how they're supposed to work. Sometimes the right conversation with the right person can solve problems that would otherwise be impossible to fix. And people pay you billions of dollars for this?" "People pay me for results. The money accumulates because I've been doing this for 15 years, and I'm very good at it. Most of my wealth comes from equity stakes in companies I've helped, investments I've made based on information I have access to, and fees from governments and corporations who need problems solved quietly." Sarah was quiet for several minutes, processing this information. "At the wedding, when Jonathan called you boss, is he actually your employee?" "Jonathan's father asked me to mentor him when he was in college. I've been advising him on business decisions for about 10 years. He calls me boss because that's how he sees our relationship, even though I don't technically own any part of his family's company. How many people like Jonathan are there? People I advise. Maybe 200 around the world. Most of them are in similar situations. Inheriting companies or political positions, running organizations that have global impact. I help them understand how their decisions affect systems they don't fully comprehend. And they all have your phone number?" Marcus smiled. "Most of them have a phone number that reaches my assistant, who decides whether their situation actually requires my attention. But yes, when they have real problems, they know how to find me." Sarah stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the lights of San Francisco. "Marcus, I'm worth $15 billion, and I felt completely out of my depth at that wedding. You're telling me you have that kind of influence over hundreds of people who are each worth billions themselves?"
Influence isn't the right word.
"I provide perspective and access to information. These people make their own decisions, but they trust your judgment enough to base those decisions on your advice. Usually." Sarah turned back to face him. "Why did you want to date me? And please don't say it was because you found me charming in a coffee shop." Someone with your resources doesn't accidentally bump into tech CEOs. You could have met me through any number of official channels if you'd wanted to. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. You're right. Meeting you wasn't entirely accidental. I had been reading about your company, following your congressional testimony about AI regulation. I was impressed by how you handled yourself, how you managed to be both brilliant and principled in an environment that rewards neither quality. So you sought me out. I went to that coffee shop because I knew you sometimes worked there when you wanted to get away from your office. I thought I might introduce myself, maybe see if you'd be interested in discussing some of the policy issues around artificial intelligence. I had no intention of asking you out. What changed? You did. You weren't what I expected. Most successful people, when you meet them in casual settings, are still performing. They're still thinking about their image, their brand, how the conversation might benefit them. But you were just being yourself. You were tired, slightly frustrated with your work, genuinely interested in the book I was reading. For the first time in years, I had a conversation with someone who wasn't trying to get something from me. Sarah sat back down in her chair. And you thought it would be possible to have a normal relationship while keeping your real life secret? I hoped it would be. I thought maybe if I could just be Marcus the consultant instead of Marcus the power broker, we could get to know each other without all the complications that come with my actual life. But that's not sustainable, is it? No, Marcus said. It's not. Which is why I'm here, being honest with you, even though I know it probably changes everything between us. Sarah looked at Marcus across her desk. This man, who had somehow accumulated more wealth and influence than most small countries, who could solve problems that stumped world leaders, who lived his entire life behind a carefully constructed facade of normalcy. And yet, sitting in her office with coffee from their neighborhood shop, he looked exactly like the person she had fallen for. It does change everything, she said finally. But maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing. 6 months after the wedding, that changed everything. Sarah found herself in a place she never could have imagined. She was sitting in the back of a private jet flying over the Pacific Ocean, reviewing documents for a meeting that would determine the fate of a telecommunications company worth $30 billion. Across from her, Marcus was on an encrypted phone call with someone in Singapore, speaking in the careful, diplomatic language that she had learnt was how he handled international crises. The transition to Marcus's real world had been neither smooth nor immediate. After their conversation in her office, they had spent weeks learning how to navigate a relationship where both partners operated at levels of wealth and influence that most people couldn't comprehend. Sarah discovered that dating Marcus meant having her background investigated by his security team, learning to recognize when their phones might be monitored, and understanding that their relationship had implications for companies and governments around the world. It also meant access to a world she had never known existed. Through Marcus, Sarah met people who shaped global policy from behind the scenes, who moved markets with casual conversations, who solved international problems that never appeared in newspapers because they were handled before they became public crises. She attended dinners where the guest list included Nobel Prize winners, former presidents, and tech pioneers whose names were known to everyone but whose faces were recognized by almost no one. The learning curve had been steep. Sarah was used to being the smartest person in most rooms, but Marcus's world operated on levels of complexity that challenged even her considerable intellect. The first time she accompanied him to what he called a consultation, helping the European government manage a banking crisis that could have destabilized their entire economy, she realized that her success in the tech industry had prepared her for some aspects of this larger game, but not others. The Singapore situation is resolved, Marcus said, ending his call and settling back in his seat. The regulatory approval will come through next week. What was the problem? Sarah asked, looking up from her own documents. The usual. Politicians who didn't understand the technical implications of the decisions they were making, bureaucrats who were more concerned with covering themselves than solving problems, and business executives who thought they could force a solution through money and connections. And you fixed it by explaining to each party what the others actually needed, rather than what they said they wanted. Most international business problems are really communication problems disguised as policy disputes. Sarah had learned to appreciate the elegant simplicity of how Marcus approached complex situations. While others spent months navigating bureaucratic procedures and political sensitivities, Marcus could often resolve issues with a few well-placed phone calls and meetings. His power came not from money or official authority, but from understanding how systems actually worked and knowing who held real influence within those systems. Their own relationship had been a test case for these same principles. Sarah had initially struggled with the idea that Marcus's resources made her own success seem insignificant. But Marcus had helped her understand that wealth and influence weren't competitive. that her expertise in artificial intelligence and technology policy made her valuable to his network in ways that had nothing to do with relative net worth. "There's something I want to discuss with you," Marcus said as the jet began its descent toward Tokyo. "I've been offered an opportunity that would be significant for both of us." Sarah set down her papers and gave him her full attention. Over the past 6 months, she had learned that when Marcus said something was significant, it usually meant that governments or multinational corporations were involved. "The United Nations is creating a new committee to address global technology policy," Marcus continued. "They want someone to chair it who has both technical expertise and the ability to navigate international political complexities. They've asked me to recommend someone. And I told them they should ask you." Sarah felt a familiar combination of excitement and nervousness. "Marcus, I run a $15 billion company. I can't just take on a UN position. You wouldn't have to give up your company. This would be a consulting role, maybe 20 days a year. But with the authority to shape how artificial intelligence is regulated globally. You'd be working with ministers of technology from G20 countries, setting standards that will affect how AI develops for the next decade." Sarah was quiet for several minutes, considering the implications. A year ago, her ambitions had been focused on growing her company and establishing herself as a leader in the tech industry. Now Marcus was offering her the opportunity to influence global policy at the highest levels of international governance. "Why me?" she asked finally. "Because you understand both the technical details and the policy implications. Because you've proven that you can work with government officials without being intimidated or corrupted by the process. And because you're one of the few people in technology who thinks beyond quarterly profits to long-term consequences. And because I'm dating you?"
Marcus smiled.
"That doesn't hurt. But Sarah, I wouldn't recommend you for something this important if I didn't believe you were the best person for the job. My reputation depends on the quality of my recommendations." As the plane touched down in Tokyo, Sarah found herself thinking about how much her life had changed since that rainy Tuesday morning in the coffee shop. She had gone from being a successful entrepreneur to being part of a network that operated at the intersection of business, politics, and international relations. The challenges were more complex, the stakes were higher, and the opportunities were unlike anything she had imagined possible. The meeting they were attending was typical of Marcus's work. A gathering of technology executives, government officials, and financial leaders who were trying to structure a joint venture that would bring high-speed internet to rural areas across Asia. The project involved 4 governments, 12 corporations, and about $40 billion in investment. Sarah's role was to provide technical consulting on the AI systems that would manage the network infrastructure. But as she listened to the presentations and watched Marcus facilitate discussions between people who had been unable to agree on anything for 6 months, Sarah realized that her real education was in understanding how decisions that affected millions of people were actually made. The public process of international cooperation, the treaties, the press conferences, the official announcements, was largely theater. The real work happened in rooms like this one, where people who understood both the technical details and the political realities could find solutions that satisfied everyone's core interests. After 2 days of meetings, they had reached an agreement that would bring internet access to over 50 million people while providing reasonable returns to the investors and satisfying the regulatory requirements of all 4 governments. As they flew back to San Francisco, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment that was different from anything she had experienced in business. They had solved a problem that would genuinely improve people's lives, and they had done it by finding ways for competing interests to work together rather than against each other. "So," Marcus said as they approached California, "have you decided about the UN position?"
"I want to do it," Sarah said.
"But I have conditions. Such as, I want to maintain control of my company. I want transparency about who I'm working with and why. And I want your promise that you'll never use our relationship to influence my recommendations to the committee." "Agreed on all counts," Marcus said immediately. "Though I should warn you that once you start working at this level, it becomes addictive. Solving problems that affect millions of people is more engaging than optimizing quarterly earnings reports." 6 months later, Sarah was sitting in a conference room at the United Nations headquarters in New York, leading a discussion with technology ministers from 12 countries about standards for artificial intelligence in autonomous vehicles. The recommendations they developed would become the foundation for international law governing self-driving cars, affecting how the technology would be deployed globally for the next decade. After the meeting, she found Marcus waiting for her in the lobby. He had been in New York for his own meetings, something involving currency markets and trade disputes that he couldn't discuss in detail, but that apparently required conversations with officials from the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department. How did it go? He asked as they walked toward the car that would take them to the airport. Better than expected. We reached consensus on safety standards and liability frameworks. It should be enough to allow for coordinated development without stifling innovation. And how do you feel about it?
Sarah considered the question as they settled into the back seat.
Powerful, she said finally. In a way that's completely different from running a company. When I make decisions for Chen Technologies, I affect my employees and our customers. When I make recommendations to this committee, I affect how technology develops globally. And that doesn't intimidate you? It terrifies me, Sarah said honestly. But it also feels like what I was meant to do. Marcus took her hand as the car pulled away from the United Nations building. For what it's worth, I think you were meant to do this too. I've watched you work at this level for almost a year now, and you have something that most people in this world lack, which is, you remember that the point of power is to solve problems, not to accumulate more power. You use influence to create results that actually matter. As they drove through Manhattan toward the airport, Sarah reflected on how much her definition of success had evolved. A year ago, she had measured her worth by the valuation of her company and her recognition within the tech industry. Now she measured it by the scope of problems she could help solve and the number of people who might benefit from her decisions. She had learned that true power wasn't about wealth or status or recognition. It was about understanding complex systems well enough to find solutions that others couldn't see, and having access to the networks that could implement those solutions on a global scale. Marcus had given her entry to that world, but she had proven herself within it through her own competence and judgment. Their relationship had evolved too, from the simple dynamic of two people who enjoyed each other's company to a partnership between equals who operated at the highest levels of international business and policy. They were both individuals who could shape global events, but they were stronger together than either was alone. The coffee shop where they had first met was still there, and they still went there sometimes when they wanted to remember how their story had started. But they both understood that those early days of modest consulting projects and casual dinners belonged to a different phase of their lives. They had become part of something larger, a network of people who worked behind the scenes to solve the kinds of problems that determined how the world actually functioned. As their plane lifted off from New York, heading toward whatever crisis or opportunity awaited them in San Francisco, Sarah smiled at the memory of her younger self, worrying about whether she was impressive enough for a coffee shop encounter. She had learned that the most important question wasn't whether you were impressive enough for someone else's world, but whether you were capable enough to help build a better one.